Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Before I turn it over to Lord Mandelson today, just a brief bio of him. Well, first of all, thank you very much to our friends at Lazard for their help with today's program. Peter Mandelson is a senior advisor to Lazard since 2011, and he is chairman of the advisory firm Global Counsel. He entered UK Parliament in 1992 and led the Labour Party's campaign in 1997, becoming a close advisor to Tony Blair. He also served as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and Secretary of State for Business, and he has a degree from Oxford University. Now, please join me in welcoming him to the Council. Thank you.
Just one small correction before I start. It's true, I directed the 1997 general election campaign that brought Tony Blair to power. Unprecedented landslide victory, a majority so big you couldn't even begin to measure it. And I do not take all the credit for it either. I mean, just so as to make that absolutely clear. But I also have to submit other evidence, which was that I had also directed the Labour Party's campaign 10 years before in 1987. I am older than I look. But I started it off I was very young. I became campaign director of the Labour Party at the age of 31, so I was very young. And I'm afraid that the 1987 general election campaign didn't have quite the same result as 1997. Now, it's a great pleasure to be back in Chicago. It's lovely to see John Riley. Thank you very, very much for turning up, John, because I've known you from old, although I don't think we have met or talked for about 17 years. I think I was last in Chicago speaking in the year 2000 when I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. But it's lovely to be back in what is, yes, a windy city, but it's also just the most beautiful, architecturally brilliant city I know. And yesterday I took some time to go on a riverboat architectural tour. How many of you have been on the architectural boat tour? Not enough. I mean, congratulations, and there's a guy called Jim, and he will give you the tour of your life, and I wish yesterday had been as nice as it is today. Thank you very much, Peter, for bringing that wonderful English sunny weather to Chicago. It's a pleasure. And on this sunny day, I'm going to talk to you about politics in the US and Europe, which I'm afraid is not quite so sunny, but it is repairable, is essentially my message. And that's what I want to talk about today. The future of Europe, but I could just as easily be talking about the future of the United States. So closely are our futures dependent on each other. You know, America and Europe both succeed when the other is doing well. And currently, we are not doing brilliantly in our politics. We are going through a period of high risk with, yes, threats from outside, but perhaps even greater challenges to us driven by what's going on at home and the divisions that have emerged in both and all our countries. Why is this? It's because we are still seeing the political aftershocks of the 2008 global financial crisis. Growth remains less than robust. Public spending is squeezed. But it's a lot wider than low growth numbers. We're living through an era of great change. China, risen. Gender roles, changing. Some industries decline, others rise. It's exciting. Once prosperous communities now struggle as other ones prosper. And on both sides of the Atlantic, we are in the wake of these conditions seeing the rise of a politics of pessimism and a politics of economic nationalism. They're striking a chord, both with the economically left behind, but also those who feel that they and their values are being left out. And they play on a ubiquitous cynicism about politics and politicians, only some of which is justified. And there are certainly challenges for someone like me. Cards on the table. I am what it says on the tin. I am a centre-left person. I hold progressive values. I believe that globalization is a net positive. I am a globalizer. But I'm also a proud Brit. I love my country. I'm a patriot, not a nationalist. And I'm someone who believes that pooling sovereignty between countries holds the key to solving many of our global challenges. I'm a cosmopolitan. I'm a liberal. I am a believer in the values of community and of solidarity, and I am a champion of extending opportunity to all. And it's on that basis, just so as you know who you're listening to, I want to do two things today. First, I want to challenge the pessimist and nationalist arguments, while acknowledging that those who share my views haven't got everything right either. And secondly, I want to make the case for progress and for hope. There could not be two better places, Chicago and London, where I've flown from, in my view, to exemplify optimism about globalization. From Jakarta to Delhi, from Cape Town to Dubai, there are dozens of great cities that aspire to be the next London or the next Chicago. And when I travel to these cities, as I do in my work for Lazard or in my role as chairman of Global Council, I rarely hear complaints about competition from imported goods and services. I rarely hear complaints about immigration. People want, in these places, across Asia, and indeed increasingly in Africa, they want to internationalize, they want to grow, they want to get on. Now, when on the other hand, I think of my former constituency in northern England, once a great centre of coal mining, of industry and trade, it's a port, where more than 65% of people voted last year to leave the European Union. It's a big number. And indeed, when I hear of counties in Ohio where 70% of people voted for President Trump, it is, of course, a very different story. Voters giving up on promises of a bigger pie because they don't see a slice reaching them or their families anytime soon. Promises broken of manufacturing jobs being replaced by new industries, their neighborhoods changing character through migration or economic flux, and it's unsettling for people. Division between cities and smaller towns, between those who can take opportunities and those who are isolated from the opportunities that are being created. 9 months on from Brexit, 3 months on from Trump, and who knows, maybe 3 months before France's Le Pen, all these observations about people being denied opportunities, their anxiety, their fear, are regrettable but not unique. And in the city that forms the backdrop for a book entitled The Audacity of Hope, now is the time, in my view, for mainstream politicians to stand up against the nostalgists, to stand up against what is being pumped into people's heads day in, day out, not by defending the present, because I think those of us who are mainstream politicians, who occupy the center ground of politics, have too often been forced back into a defense of the status quo, which has put us on the defensive. No, instead we should be offering not a defense of the status quo, because it ain't perfect. We should be offering a clearer, more convincing belief in the future and what we can create and how we can extend opportunity to so many more people in the future if we organize our economies and the massive technological openings that are occurring now for the majority, for the many, not the few. And 10 years ago in Springfield, Senator Obama's campaign inspired people around the world, even as they questioned whether the system was actually working for them in the depths of the financial crisis. The sources of this hope and its demand for change challenge current policy assumptions and are therefore also sources of risk because of the changes in policy that I believe are necessary, which I want to come back to later in my remarks. But I cannot emphasize enough, renewal is necessary. Actually, it's absolutely vital, and that price that we will pay for change and of renewal, in my view, will be a price worth paying for all of us, including our business community. Now, we've seen in history how popular revolts become too powerful suddenly to ignore. And the center has to react, and business too. When I was Trade Secretary after Tony Blair came to office in 1997, you know, globalization was mostly a sort of intellectual concept. I remember I deployed the arguments, I used the terminology of free movements, open trade, open markets. Isn't it wonderful? We're all going to create one big sort of global economy. And we spoke about that approvingly and confidently without actually explaining or thinking through many of the consequences of globalization for our societies. We underplayed the impact on people and their neighborhoods, how the gains would be justified, would be distributed as a result of growing economies. And we didn't really think through who and how people were going to carry the burden of adjustment, which has become very considerable indeed. Yes, in Britain we introduced a national minimum wage, and we introduced in-work income supplements for people who were in work but poor, and we boosted investment. My God, did we invest in cities, in infrastructure, in education and training and health services, more than any government had done at any time in the post-war era in government. But the modern global economy was overtaking us all the time, and the changes that it was bringing were taking place at breakneck speed. And by the time I was Europe's trade commissioner in the 2000s, I saw resistance growing from the other side of the trade equation. Producer interests in advanced economies, less able to compete against the emerging economies elsewhere in the world. And workers in Europe, frankly, seeing the playing field increasingly tilt against them, or so they felt. Now, I remember at the time when I was Trade Commissioner, I had a lot to do with President George W. Bush, and he talked to me in the White House. I remember at the time of how rising protectionism, nationalism, and a new word to me at the time, nativism, in America were eating into mainstream politics, and we see how this playbook has ended up. So what do we in the West, in the US, in Europe and Britain, do about this situation? How do we adapt our economic model so as to restore greater faith in it. I believe that we need a reset, a political reset. For too long, the centre ground has been paralyzed in its thinking and its action. And we cannot allow those who shout loudest to continue to have it all their own way. Some growth and modest redistribution, frankly, will not suffice to carry out this political reset. We need a more radical proposition. Recent elections in the US and Europe have shown that tweaking the policy dial a bit just simply doesn't work against the impact of the insurgent political forces that we are now seeing emerging in all our democracies. Bluntly, we need to go a lot further in order to achieve a realignment of politics that will reclaim the swing voters that the centre ground has been losing to the extremists. We've reinvented ourselves in the past. We've done it before, and we can do it again. We reinvented ourselves when our system of liberal democracy has been under pressure. In the 1930s, after the fall, when the US economy was being buffeted by depression, President Roosevelt established the radical idea, now of course widely accepted, that the state has a significant role in managing the economic cycle and coming to the rescue of those whose jobs and livelihoods are being destroyed. The creation of the Bretton Woods system of global institutions and the application of Keynesian social democracy in Europe after the war, supported by the Marshall Plan, made it impossible for the populism of that time, red communism, to gain a meaningful hold, either in the US or in Western Europe. We saw a further reset of liberalism led by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, the Great Society and the establishment of civil rights and race equality that could no longer be deferred. Now, it wasn't easy to bring the southern states round when LBJ was mounting this fight back, but the centre ground was strong enough to do so. It thought through what it was doing, it knew what it stood for, it knew what it needed to happen, and it went out and persuaded people, and we've got to do that again. And we saw a different sort of reset in the 1980s when President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher argued that a system managed by corporatist insiders and vested interests was hampering enterprise and failing to offer opportunity to those with aspiration. Now, this was controversial because it emphasized faster growth at the expense of cohesion in society. But it was a reset that, broadly speaking, a consensus of opinion supported at the time. But then in a response to this in Europe, by the way, incidentally, because it's relevant now, was the creation of the highly ambitious single regulated market for goods and services across Europe, still growing today, that single market, which promoted high labour market standards and protections against social dumping in exchange for liberalising trade. There was a bargain to be struck, in other words, between liberal economics and social concern and social justice. And we saw then a further reset in the 1990s when the New Democrats and New Labour, responding to deepening divisions in society, again realigned the centre ground of politics to balance economic dynamism more explicitly with social justice. In each case, politicians of the centre listened to the concerns of voters, recognized that the status quo was unsustainable, and offered realistic and practical alternatives. And that's what we've got to do again. And in doing so, we were able to marginalize the more extreme voices who ultimately could only offer anger and cynicism. Now, we have to do this again, but it's not simple. It requires radical rethinking of how to achieve our goals and to build a new base of support in our democracies, modernizing our use of communications also in order to do so. And we should draw inspiration from that most radical of rethinks, the New Deal and the American dream it gave rise to. We have to recreate that dream for a new era and a new century. But we shouldn't underestimate the challenge we face. The public are being fed easy answers, slogans based on identity politics rather than ideology. It's not really left or right. It's sort of an appeal to a sort of gut emotionalism about people's identity. And of course we're seeing too a technological revolution which is further expanding the pool of footloose and uncertain voters whose allegiance we are competing for. The technological revolution is far greater in its implications and its impact than globalization is in itself. And that is going to increase people's insecurity. It's going to make them more footloose. It's going to make them more uncertain, and therefore, in my view, up for grabs to those in politics who are unscrupulous. Now, slogans like "take back control" for Brexit, or "in the name of the people" for the Front National in France, or even "America first," are designed actually to avoid hard policy choices. They'll ultimately fail, I'm sure about that, and I'm equally sure that the rest of us will become the scapegoats when they do fail. Be confident about that. But these are slogans that are emotional. They appeal to something in people's hearts and their guts, and that's why they're so potent. But waiting for what they're doing in government to fail is not good enough. We've got to offer a positive alternative, and that, frankly, on the centre-left and the centre-right, we've been failing to do for many years. There is, however, some encouragement. In Britain, it's true that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, in lockdown over Brexit, is, in my view, pursuing a series of strategic misjudgments which could result in Britain crashing out of the European Union without a deal on trade, without a deal on investment, or cross-border policing or defence. And this would be undoubtedly calamitous for Britain's future prosperity and security. And I work every day and pray to God that it doesn't end up in that way, but it's not looking good. But interestingly, same Prime Minister, Mrs. May, recognizing that our economic model relies too heavily on insecurity for individuals to deliver profits, says she wants to build a new centre ground that, and I quote, improves the security and rights of ordinary working people in a country and an economy that works for everyone and not just the privileged few. Quite an indictment coming from a centre-right politician, and all the more important and powerful for it. And she's definitely buried Margaret Thatcher's approach towards manufacturing by launching an explicit industrial strategy. But then again in France, presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron has gone further, arguing that traditional party politics, as we've known it, is dead, and that a more flexible movement between the centre-left and centre-right is needed in order to overhaul the economy and society of his country. His policy programme is still under development, but it promises protection, for example, cracking down on antisocial behaviour, taking a robust approach to trade defence, but also, in addition to protection, opportunity, with a state investment programme and more equal treatment of workers outside traditional bargaining structures. And in the European Union institutions themselves, Commission President Juncker has recognised that irreversible momentum towards integration has in fact stalled, and has started a debate Juncker has about how the EU can be strengthened through reform, i.e. got back on track and in some sort of correspondence with the people it works for. And I've no doubt that the purpose of the European Union as a source of power to protect European interests and to project our values is as valid now as it was to create peace, to reunify Eastern and Western Europe, and to generate unprecedented prosperity, which is what the European community and union has done for us since it was created following the Second World War. The Eurozone and its currency are not threatened, but nonetheless profound questions exist of political identity, of solidarity and legitimacy of the whole European project, which need to be addressed. And in my view, no amount of institutional redesign will substitute for practical, tangible policy evidence of the EU's value in the years to come. In other words, institutional redesign is no substitute for real policy delivery, which is going to deliver more prosperity and more security and more protection and opportunity for people in Europe in the future, and that's what we have to focus on. Now, inevitably, this will include examination of the contribution and the responsibilities of businesses. I want to say a little bit about that now because I think it's very important. In Europe, there is still a consensus on the centre-left and the centre-right that politics must harness the energy and the disciplines of the market and the technology that comes from business innovation. But this consensus, I have to say, is more fragile than at any time in the last 40 years. The consensus hasn't broken up, but it's weaker than it was. Business, therefore, has either to become part of the solution to the sort of political problems that I've been talking about, or it will be in the line of fire for people and insurgent political forces which are going to threaten their license to operate. So what does this necessary rethink of policy mean for business? It will mean new challenges for companies, particularly those operating across borders. It will lead to higher expectations of how businesses treat workers, a questioning of models based on self-employment, Uber, etc. Models that don't really give a fair balance of rights and responsibilities for those workers. It will mean fewer opportunities to optimize, as they say, actually avoid tax. I'm looking at Lazard here. With calculations of liabilities based on the sources of revenue as well as the nominal location of profits. Let's face it, international companies have got away with a great deal for a very long time, and people are now saying enough is enough. Technological disruption will continue. But we have to realize that for many people, not just in the United States but across Europe, for many people disruption translates slightly less well outside Silicon Valley. And its impact needs to be managed. People have to be helped to adjust and to embrace and both the opportunities but also the consequences of disruptive technologies. Honesty and transparency are needed about how customer and employee data is used, including where control of data creates unfair market power and where there is already dangerous pressure for the state to micromanage the market in this area. And we already see examples of how these pressures that are building up, on and against businesses and how they've operated and learned to operate with some impunity to date, can also translate into some very, very poorly designed policy, policy that destroys rather than protects, such as border adjustment taxes or forced data localization, as we're now seeing pushed in many European countries and others. But the largest challenges, in my view, will be for countries to continue to work together to align regulation, to reduce friction at borders, and allow skilled people to move around to provide services, as the European Union and to a lesser extent the World Trade Organization stand for and do presently. The biggest risk in the current political debate is that we move from the undeniable truth that globalization could work better to the false conclusion that we are better off without it. And that is absolutely at the heart of the challenge we face. Globalization, having created so much uncertainty, so many losers as well as winners, disrupted so many people's lives and communities, many of those people are coming to the conclusion that actually it would be better to turn the clock back, use politics to reverse globalization than to make it work better. And that is at the heart of the policy challenge that we on the centre ground of politics face. Now, in Europe, in the case of Brexit, perhaps the costs of, in the case of Brexit, if the UK and the EU can find ways to secure trade between them and designing and enforcing new rules and winning public support for the significant compromises that the UK and the EU are going to have to make for this to work, perhaps that will generate confidence internationally. Certainly, the costs of failure to do so have to be brought home to the UK and the EU before this happens, including the huge economic burden that they would face of having to duplicate functions and activities in both the UK and the EU and to comply, expect businesses to comply with very different market rules. Absolute disaster for everyone concerned. Not least because it will limit the ability of European and British firms to grow and innovate, passing opportunities to their global competitors. Yes, some American as well as Asian ones, who will then be in a much better position. You know, if we're dividing the way we work and the basis on which businesses can trade and do businesses with others, they're just going to eat our lunch. Indeed, many speculate that the greatest beneficiaries of cutting off London's financial sector from mainland Europe will not be any European financial sector, but actually it will be New York or Singapore or Shanghai that will be benefiting. So let me just say to you this in conclusion to you. In 1999, you will remember, some of you, that Tony Blair came to Chicago and made a very, very important speech. It was really a speech about the responsibility to protect others vulnerable in different parts of the world. And he argued that global cooperation and global institutions such as NATO were necessary and indeed had a duty to protect human rights, and that they had a duty too to adapt to new threats and new opponents that were emerging in the world. In my view, ladies and gentlemen, we face a similar challenge today to adapt and renew the case for our global economic cooperation and the international institutions that promote this. Is the West capable of such resolve, or are we just sort of inevitably in decline, sort of entering a post-Western world? Well, my answer to that emphatically is no. We're not entering that post-Western world that others like to talk about, because our people, our businesses, our rule of law, and our capacity for innovation continue to succeed and shape the rest of the world. But will we experience continued political risk and mounting political risk if we don't do enough to reform and adapt? And the answer to that is absolutely. And this applies not just to the West, but elsewhere in the world, and across the waterfront of public policy, where we've got to put our thinking caps on and come up with some very different and better answers than those we have at the moment, whether in respect of tax and social security, or education and skills and healthcare. And that's why we need to act with equal amounts of humility and determination, offering hope instead of cynicism and progress instead of fracture within our societies. We need a competition of ideas between the centre-left and centre-right. But first we must deal with this nonsense that what matters most is somehow bringing back some idealized past, which is what the nationalists and the jingoists are trying to persuade us of. And as someone who's been through many dark days for progressives before, I know the importance of first understanding why we are where we are, why voters are where they are, and to draw inspiration for the hard work ahead. We in the West can only move forwards. We're not going to move backwards. We can only move forwards as economies and as societies. But the thing that we have got to make sure of is that as we travel together, we do so with no one left behind. And that's our great task now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Lord Mandelson. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for questions. If you could please raise your arm, wait for the mic, and make sure your question's a question. Right over here, Caroline Craycraft, please.
Welcome back, Lord Mandelson.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Slightly parochial question, I fear. Brexit and Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Do you think the conflict could be reignited if the polarisation that we've seen in the latest election for the devolved assembly continues and Brexit with a hard border happens? I think it was a soft border that made the Good Friday Agreement possible.
It was basically, to all intents and purposes, practically no border at all that made the Good Friday peace agreement possible, recognising that the economy in Ireland is becoming an all-island economy, embracing North and South. And that is breaking down the divisions, the polarization, the sectarian opposition between people. Literally, thousands, tens of thousands of people, students, goods, services travel freely back and forth across the border, North and South, every day. And what Brexit, and what a hard Brexit could mean, is that Britain, out of the single market, out of the customs area, has to reimpose a border there between North and South, properly policed, customs posts, all the rest, people stopped, checked, passports examined. Now, for some people in Northern Ireland, let me tell you, they're rather looking forward to this. The sectarians are rather looking forward to it. The people who, actually still want to institutionalize that conflict between North and South because they're on the extremes and they think they're going to benefit from that greater sectarianism. They're the people who have got to be defeated, not rewarded, which is what we would be doing if we allowed any sort of hard border to emerge as a result of Brexit across the island of Ireland. Very, very important indeed. As the Prime Minister says, I hear you. I know what you're saying. I know what we have to avoid. But how to avoid it when the trajectory they're on is so harsh and so hard, I don't know. But it's very important. Thanks for the question.
Oh, yeah, next question, please. Lyric Hughes-Hill.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think the question we are all thinking about, and maybe that you haven't answered, is on one hand, what is the possibility over the next 2 years that Brexit could be reversed? And on the other hand, within the next 5 years, that the European Union could fall apart? Where would you place probabilities on that spectrum? Thank you.
Unlikely to very, very unlikely on both counts. I don't believe that in present circumstances it will be possible to reverse Brexit. I can't see how the politics will come together to enable this to happen. Why? Because, as I said, the Prime Minister is in a sort of lockdown by the 3 or so sets of newspaper proprietors and editors who control about 75% of the press circulation in Britain, and they're all hard Brexiters. They've been driving this as their agenda for 20 years. They've got their way. They're not going to let go now. Also because the Conservative Party, which, like the Republicans in the US, has always been sort of divided between internationalists and nationalists, but always with the internationalists with the upper hand, the whip hand. I mean, every Prime Minister, every Conservative Prime Minister, right up until and including a part of Mrs. Thatcher's premiership, she sort of wobbled and became more nationalist in the last year and in her retirement. But then, of course, the internationalists took back control of the party, John Major, David Cameron, etc. But that balance is tilted now within the Conservative Party much more towards the nationalists, away from the internationalists. So whatever sort of economic rationality that the Prime Minister might like to assert, that actually a hard, clean break between Britain and Europe would be immensely damaging to our trade and investment, and therefore to jobs and livelihoods in Britain. Politically, she is in this, as I say, a sort of lockdown, and it's politics, not economics, which is driving Brexit now. You asked about the European Union. Look, if Marine Le Pen wins the presidency of France, and it's possible, I remember most of my friends in America telling me that President Trump would never be elected here. So it's possible, and if she does become president of France, then as far as European Union is concerned, all bets are off. France is an odd place. Lovely place. But an odd place. They are the absolute bastion and bulwark of European unity and integration. But at the same time, how can I put it? So French. They are both integrated and separate, sort of simultaneously. Basically, they've always been pro-European because they think the job of the European Union is to project the glory of France. And this is how the two things have meshed. But Marine Le Pen and many of the people who are voting for her just don't see it like that. They see Europe as laying down the law, intruding, making decisions that should be better taken at home, tying us up with all the red tape and all the other sort of propaganda that spews out. And I think she will be true to her word if she's elected. I think she will try to pull France out of the single currency, the Eurozone. I think she'll mount a referendum on France's membership of the European Union. I wouldn't like to predict at this stage what the outcome of that referendum would be. France has already lost one referendum on Europe in 2005, and it only narrowly won the referendum on the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. So France has a long tradition of being pro-European and pro-France, and I think a very real danger exists for France that if she becomes president, everything will be thrown up in the air, and heaven knows where we'll see things land after that.
Thank you. I know we have a student group here from York Community High School. Do you have any questions for Lord Mandelson?
Hi, York Community High School.
Yeah. There's a question?
I mean, why didn't you just ask anything that you like, anything that, I mean, obviously within reason, that sort of comes into your head?
Do you have a question?
Don't worry. Okay. Hi, I'm Molly Grassi. So,
Hi, Molly.
what is your assessment of the situation in Greece, and what kind of effect or impact on Greece do you think it has on the EU stability?
Well, the problem in Greece is that economically it's not taken the steps, as I would see it, and implemented the reforms and changes it needs in order to keep up with the rest of the European economy. It has huge strengths, great appeal. People love going to Greece, but it doesn't have a big enough economy. Its economy is not productive enough, and it needs... when the financial crisis broke, sparking the banking crisis, and which turned into a sovereign debt crisis, which turned into a political crisis, which turned into a crisis of Europe's currency, still Greece didn't do enough, didn't go far enough to repair things, in my view. But at the same time, laboured under quite extreme and quite draconian sort of conditions and requirements that were exacted by the rest of the European Union and the IMF, the international community, in order to sort out their public finances. They still haven't sorted out the public finances. Nonetheless, markets, sovereign debt markets, are calm in Europe. If, however, there was a trigger, either in Greece or elsewhere, who knows what turbulence might re-emerge in those markets, and therefore, what threat might arise again to Greece's economic and therefore political stability. So they're not out of the woods. They're stabilized, but they're not sort of healed or cured. One thing that is interesting, though, in Greece is the way in which, and perhaps I should have mentioned this, how political thinking and support is actually moving back to the center, away from the more populist left extremes of the Syriza party. And it's interesting that the center-right National Party, a centrist party in Greece, is now gathering support as many people look at what the left said they would do and what they would deliver, and the disappointment that they feel, and wonder if perhaps more mainstream politicians have a better answer to provide than the one that's coming from the existing Syriza-led government. So Greece is an example both of where not enough has been done to repair the country economically, but where its politics, as I would see it, are perhaps moving back to a more recognizably mainstream position than was previously the case.
Question here from John Riley, please. One sec, John, the mic's just behind you. John, we need the mic because we're on live stream, thanks.
I think most would agree that the United States played an indispensable role, beginning with the Marshall Plan, extending through the Treaty of Rome, and later with every American government supporting the proposition of European unity. Today, there's a real question about whether the newly elected Trump government will continue that tradition. Do you foresee any possibility that this government could fundamentally undermine the European Union's continuity?
Well, I know that the man whose name conveniently escapes me at the moment, who is being touted as the next US ambassador to the European Union, publicly, repeatedly says that he's in favor of the breakup of the European Union. I mean, obviously, it's not going to receive an absolutely sort of ecstatic welcome when he arrives in Brussels. And I just think it's so unnecessary, so avoidable, and so daft, frankly. America needs its allies in the world. There are no stronger, better allies in the world than those of us in Europe. And organizing our unity, building up our strength economically, but therefore also in respect of our security and military are absolutely essential to American interests and what America and the security that America rightly requires in the rest of the world. And I'm afraid that sometimes you hear coming from Mr. Trump's circle, from the White House, the same sort of simplistic slogans and sort of idiotic assertions about Europe that you hear, frankly, from the nationalists and the jingoists in Europe itself. You know, how, you know, Europe has tied itself up in red tape. European businesses can no longer operate because of the rules and regulations and their burden imposed on them. That Europe is only there to meet sort of European needs and exercise European prejudices, and that the European Union is some inward-looking protectionist bloc that doesn't know or care about the rest of the world, etc., etc., etc. It is not true about Europe and the European Union. The European Union is a massive champion, an upholder of global free trade and international trade rules. I mean, yes, we sort of look after our own where we can, as everyone else does, but not at the expense of free trade and not at the expense of the WTO and the international trading system that it operates. And yes, actually, we have been spending of late less on defence, because public spending has been squeezed over the last 10 years, given financially and economically what we've been going through, and that does need to change. I mean, if you're a member of an alliance, you have to pay your way in that alliance. You can't. It's not good for you. It's not good for anyone else to rely so much on American defence expenditure. So we have got to do more. We've got to repair an imbalance. But I tell you what, if Europe started to do this and to spend more on defence and create more of a collective European defence organisation or collective security for itself, I can just hear the voices in the White House saying, oh, they're trying to go their own way. You know, they're trying to separate themselves from America. So let's take them at their word. Let's, if they want to do more for themselves, let's leave them to it. I mean, with these people, you can't do anything right. And I think that rather than, create a sort of confrontational, sort of gladiatorial, sort of battle, we've just got to cast our minds back to what the world was like when it was at World War, what was going on Europe's continent when we weren't united. We've been a very, very bloody continent for hundreds of years. We've loved making war between and amongst ourselves, and it's that has been put behind us. We're now intrinsically peaceful. What do I mean by that? Economically, we're so integrated that the circumstances don't exist in which we could go to war with each other again. That is a measure of the achievement of Europe politically since the Second World War. And the US should be championing that and trying to strengthen it, not undermine it and defeat it. And I hope we don't see that coming from the administration.
One last quick question, please. David Sheffer there. Thank you.
How would you assess the future of Scotland under Brexit? It's been an evolving situation.
I'm worried. I don't think Brexit makes the case for separation of Scotland from the rest of the United Kingdom, but we have to recognise it strengthens the argument for it. In fact, I'm in Scotland that voted to remain in the European Union. Scotland, which is quite a strong financial centre of its own, aside from London, and doing a lot of business between Scotland in financial services and the rest of the European Union through the single market. Has trade worth, what, 12, 13 billion pounds a year in Europe's single market. At the same time, though, has trade with the rest of the UK of about 50 billion pounds. So there's quite an imbalance in trade interests for Scotland between Europe and the rest of the UK. But they will simply come back to you and say, well, look, we didn't want to leave the European Union. We didn't vote for it. You're not just, accepting and respecting the result of the referendum that we should leave the European Union. You're interpreting it in the hardest, most extreme way possible and taking us out not only of the European Union, but its single market, its customs union is on top of that, and that's going seriously to harm Scottish economic interests. And therefore, to stay in the European Union and its single market, we feel we need to leave the United Kingdom. It's an argument. It's not a case that is won because there are serious trade imbalances and interests that would affect it. They then, of course, would come back and say, well, look, Scotland inside the European Union, separated from the rest of the UK, would nonetheless, we'd be able to find arrangements to enable us to keep trading with the rest of the UK, and so we'd have the best of all worlds. It's an argument, but it's not a case, in my view, that has been won. But we have brought this on ourselves, in my view, not simply by voting to leave the European Union, but as the government is doing, taking us hook, line and sinker out of the rest of Europe together. And I don't blame the Scots for rebelling against it.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you again to Lazard, and thank you for your time. And thanks to, of course, Lord Mandelson for a wonderful hour. Thank you. We're adjourned.